So our next and our last keynote speaker, last but not least, is Kim Blewitt. So Kim is a chartered sport and exercise psychologist, and she's working full-time as the lead psychologist at West Bromwich Albion Football Club. So today her talk is going to be looking at psychological safety, well-being and winning. And I know in Philip's talk earlier on, we talked about kind of similar issues around well-being, but also focusing on performance as well. So I'm going to hand you over to Kim now. So hopefully you can share your slides, Kim. I will give you a kind of a 5-minute warning. I'll just kind of put my hand up to let you know that there's kind of around 5 minutes left. But yeah, any questions, just let me know. If anybody who's listening has got any questions, then again, feel free to put that in the chat so we can ask them, or we can open it up at the end.
Hi there. So thank you for the introduction and everything, and everyone for tuning in. I hope you found everything so far really insightful and useful. I found that athlete panel there really interesting. So I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about a topic that I'm really passionate about, which is psychological safety. I don't actually like the term psychological safety too much, because I find when you use it, you come up against some barriers really about what it is and what it means. And I do feel like it's got some of these negative connotations, which I'll kind of talk about in a little bit. But I think it's one of the elements of high performance that's absolutely fundamental. So I'm going to start off today with just a little bit about what psychological safety kind of is and why it's important. I'll kind of want to say a few things about these few myths, these negative connotations about what it really is, and a little bit more detail as to what it's all really about. Explaining it briefly from kind of a brain and science perspective, and then looking at how it connects to both this idea of well-being and winning. Then I kind of want to go into a little bit about assessing psychological safety. So something practically that you can look at, environments that you work within to assess what is going on in that environment. And then probably most importantly about how you can go about creating psychological safety. And I think one thing that's really important is that a single person can make a massive difference in this. I think the ladies in the panel there were talking about how a coach could be a person potentially that could make that difference if they were willing to do some of those things. So I think it's really important that you know, as what single person, you can make a really big difference. So the first question I just kind of want to pose to you to have a little bit of a think about, and if we were in a kind of a physical conference, I'd get you all to kind of discuss this in small groups, but just kind of want you to think about, can you remember a time where you had something to say that you thought mattered and was important, but you didn't feel like you could share it? So I just want you to have a little think about that. Keep maybe some examples that you've got in your mind, and just think about maybe what were some of the barriers that you had to speaking out. So I'm just going to kick off with just a little bit about me. So kind of, as said, I'm at West Bromwich Albion at the moment. I've been there since 2017. And have been on a little bit of a journey to get to that point, really. Kind of a variety of different settings, elite sports, and work with kind of 7-8-year-olds all the way up to players playing in the Premier League. I had a little bit of a different start to my journey, and I think that's kind of where my real passion for kind of well-being has come in, where I worked for Mind, the mental health charity. I worked for a local branch. And that really kind of, I think that role and the work I did there has had the biggest influence on my practice and kind of how I apply that now into elite sport setting. One of the kind of key roles that I did there was with the police around helping adults in crises. And I think that in itself taught me so many skills that could be transferred into working in a highly pressurized elite sport environment. And I think that's kind of like I say, the biggest thing that I've brought from that setting into the work I do now, and the work I do mainly now with kind of elite level and young professional footballers. So if I asked you to kind of think about an ideal athlete, or kind of what you were looking for in an athlete, kind of those key characteristics and behaviours that you would expect, lots of different things might come to mind. So lots of people talk about resilience, hard work, determination. about these athletes who are proactive and take this 24/7 approach to being an athlete. So people often talk about Cristiano Ronaldo being this pinnacle athlete of how much he puts into everything that he does, and being a real role model for young footballers. Athletes who are mentally tough, confident, disciplined. And when I think about all these skills a young elite athlete is expected to possess, or it's at least the desire that these young athletes possess that, I just think that is absolutely incredible, that what is expected of them is a challenge in itself. And while as much as possible, we want to give them a normal childhood experience, they don't have a normal childhood experience in so many ways. Especially kind of these growing athletes growing up in academy systems or within kind of elite sports systems. So a 15, 16-year-old going through their GCSEs at school, all the 15, 16-year-olds in the country, they go through a lot in terms of trying to balance school and their friends, get the results that they want to get, all of those kind of things that go on at that point in their life, as well as going through puberty and all of those things. Yet an elite athlete on top of that has the early mornings, the late nights, or whole days out of school. They have additional gym sessions, extra analysis work they need to do. They need to do psychological work. They might have a long travel. They might not be living with their family at this point. So there's a whole host of things they have to do at such a young age. And adult professional athletes also have a really quite abnormal life, really, when you think about the stresses and things that they're exposed to. They often live under a microscope. So we were talking a bit about social media there. So tabloids and the world of social media have made that kind of even more prevalent. And life as an athlete is really not an easy one because of all of those things. So for them to be able to develop and succeed in those highly pressurized situations and environments, I think it's really important to get what goes on behind the scenes right. So they've got that support system in place to help them navigate the challenges of all of that. So one of the places I worked in, the coach had this analogy of a bus, and he spoke about the coach being the driver of that bus. So the coach sets the program, decides on the game plan, and generally is kind of the leader of that person's training. The athlete steps foot on that bus every time that they come into training or a game, and they have a choice of where they want to sit on that bus. So the front of the bus, the middle of the bus, or the back of the bus. And he kind of spoke about those ones at the front of the bus being not a passive recipient. The ones at the back of the bus will be those passive recipients that, yeah, they might do everything right and they come into training and they don't cause a fuss, but they also don't actively engage in the process. So what we want is these athletes to sit at the front. We want them to actively engage, and we want them to be confident under pressure, who can thrive in competitive environments, and that involves people that will engage in that process. So we want them to understand why they're doing what they're doing, and then supporting that autonomy of their own decision making, which is really important kind of from that well-being perspective. But also they might even start to challenge the coach a little bit and have an influence on the route that they're taking. So that is a brilliant kind of thing as a coach. If you're getting somebody come to you and kind of ask those questions and want to challenge you, they're so engaged in the process then that they want to ask your advice, they want to ask for help, and they want to draw all of your knowledge to make themselves better. So these athletes, the ones that are proactive, spend time deliberately practicing, focusing on their strengths, but also their areas of development or their weaknesses. And they take ownership over that personal development then. So this is then how they become successful, because they're getting these processes right. But for this to happen, you have to be able to take accountability as an athlete and as a coach. And you have to be willing to share the mistakes and failures, and you have to be willing to speak up when you think something matters. So that kind of brings me back to the question that I posed to you a little bit before. And I would expect a lot of people to say that, yeah, at some point in your life, I'm sure you've all felt that you couldn't share something. And there are always moments where we feel threatened. And this kind of feeling is a sign of maybe a lack of psychological safety within that setting. People worry about the consequences of speaking up and maybe saying something wrong, or speaking up and then being ignored. And this is exactly what we want to avoid, because not only is that not a good feeling to have as an individual, because it kind of makes you feel a bit invalued, it also prevents us having an influence on making it to be our best. So we see in sports like Formula One, those small, tiny little margins make such a difference. They could be the difference between winning a championship and not placing at all and kind of crashing out of a race. But that sometimes relies on one person to put their hand up and say, this isn't right. And that tiny adjustment on a car that one person might have spotted could be the difference. So it's really important to create these environments where people do feel they can speak up, which brings us on to this concept of psychological safety. And I think, like I said before about these negative connotations, I think there is a bit of a misconception that it can be a bit fluffy as a concept. But I think when you look at the kind of research, so Amy Edmondson has been a pioneer into the research in this, and her research has been done in multiple settings, but originally in kind of hospitals and that medical profession. So that's where like these life or death decisions are happening. And they found that psychological safety could improve patient outcomes, because nurses and doctors then were willing to share what was not going so well. And therefore the things that they thought were unsafe, and therefore they could make better decisions moving forward. So that medical environment is obviously intense and completely interdependent on different people that are working within it. And it is these life or death decisions that are being made. So if it's important in a life or death scenario, it's certainly not kind of that fluffy concept, and it's important across all these different settings. It's not an opportunity for laziness. That's another thing that I've heard. It's really the opposite of that, because I think it's about challenge and debate, and it's about different opinions and people feeling that they can share these different opinions and hold each other accountable for them. So it's about making sure everyone is learning and stretching and challenging each other. And it doesn't mean that all mistakes are fine. I think that's another kind of real misconception of it. It's not saying that you can make a mistake and that's completely okay, but it's about saying that there's a clear distinction between different types of mistakes. So if we think about a rule violation versus kind of a thoughtful hypothesis, so a footballer breaking a COVID regulation versus a footballer missing a sort of winning chance on goal at the end of a game. They're two very different types of mistake. The COVID regulation is that real rule side of things, whereas the match winning chance that's been missed, he's not gone into that with the intention of missing. He's probably gone into that with the thought that he wanted to score that, and that was the split second decision that was made. And those two types of decisions should definitely be dealt with in a completely different way. And obviously the match winning goal, that's an opportunity to learn what went wrong in that moment to make it better next time, whereas the COVID regulation is probably a very different sanction. And I think the bottom point about wrapping athletes in cotton wool has been something I've kind of faced a little bit coming into a football world, about the perception that sometimes psychologists want to wrap these football players in cotton wool a little bit. And I found it one of the biggest barriers to accepting kind of psychological input. But really, it's kind of the total opposite of it, because you want players to thrive in challenging situations. But if players operate within this psychologically safe environment, they're able to put themselves in these challenging situations with confidence, because they're able to be vulnerable and put themselves in a place where something might not go right. Because it gives us then the foundation to build that resilience, because you can make a mistake, take responsibility for it, and then learn from it. Whereas if you make a mistake and don't take responsibility for it, there's the lack of learning that potentially takes place as a result of that. So they're able to take risks when they need to, if they've got this right environment around them. So what it is more about is this idea, like it was talked about in the panel, about we are all human. So a psychologically safe environment knows that we aren't going to be perfect. So again, kind of building on this kind of conversation about social media, we live in this world where perfection is all around us and is almost the expectation from people, that perfect life that we see on different people's social media. And it is that highlights reel of someone's life. So it's not just about looking about those really good times that happen. There's also some of the bad times that won't get shared on those platforms. And I think the young people now growing up in this kind of world where social media is so prevalent, their socialization teaches them that they need to be perfect. So it's really important that we tell them, no, you don't. Like, it's completely normal to not know everything. And that curiosity to learn more is how you'll grow and improve. And as adults, we need to keep that as coaches in settings. They need that to be able to learn more. They need that curiosity and to model that curiosity, because we don't all have it all figured out. With resilience, you need challenge, you need opportunities to fail, and you need to take responsibility. If you're building kind of resentment for mistakes, I see that on the pitch as these players that then give up when the going gets tough, rather than roll their sleeves up and think, okay, how's that challenge going to make me better now? And I think there's a real clear distinction as to which of those types of player go on to be more successful. So it's definitely about connecting on this human level, about this ability to live authentically and be ourselves as an absolutely fundamental important to our well-being, that we go into an environment and feel like we can be ourselves and we don't have to put a mask on, which can be really, really exhausting. It gives us a platform to be vulnerable and to share what we're insecure about, what makes us worried, and build these really strong personal connections, which then in turn helps with this shared common purpose of realizing what people have in common, how people are different, but then how we're all working towards this one goal, all working in that same direction to achieve that goal. So if we had a choice of environment to work in, we'd probably pick that one of psychological safety over that of psychological danger, because it feels nicer to be around. We build better connections with people. There's more enjoyment around those sorts of environments. But not only that, it's about this elite and high performance. We're never going to perform to our best if we're looking to blame somebody else when something goes wrong, because we're scared to say when something goes wrong. We'll continue to make the same mistakes and continue to be stuck in those cycles. So what a difference it then makes when someone feels they can put their hand up and go, oh yeah, I messed up on that one. And then we go back to this ideal athlete. And these characteristics are not set in stone. They can all be changed and developed and adapted. And the environments that we create around an athlete are so fundamental to developing these and the real building blocks. So I think psychological safety is the turning point for developing all of these things. And kind of this is supported by the structure of our brain and then how it works and functions. So if you quickly just bring to mind a silly mistake you made when you were either under pressure, when you were angry about something, or you might be upset about something. And I think we've all done something really silly. We've said something we regret in the heat of an argument. We've upset somebody because they've upset us. And we do this when we feel threatened. An athlete stepping foot into a performance arena, that can be seen as a threat if we haven't created the right environment for them behind closed doors. So in kind of real basic terms around the structure of the brain, it's got these three parts where you've got the brainstem, the survival part, that really primitive part of our brain. We've then got the limbic system, which is the emotional brain, and then the neocortex, which is that thinking, higher thinking part of our brain. That one gives us the ability to say sorry, to make decisions, to problem solve and to plan. So when we're under threat, it's those basic fight or flight, the survival mode. We've got nerves then that send signals to the rest of our body, which give us those physiological symptoms. But we aren't able to access those higher thinking parts of our brain when we perceive threat, because that brainstem kind of takes over. So if an athlete doesn't feel psychologically safe, for them to be able to make good decisions under pressure, for them to be able to come off the pitch and admit that they might have done something wrong or own up to some error or anything like that, they can't access the part of their brain that gives them the ability to do that. So I think that kind of just demonstrates from that perspective how important it is to create psychological safety for these athletes and players. And this is for young developing athletes as well as kind of those at the top of their level. So I think, again, when we think about this totally abnormal job of being an athlete, And being a coach in elite sport and working in elite sport in any way is a pretty abnormal element to those kind of jobs as well. But we want athletes to thrive under the pressure of competition and in front of all of these people. So a footballer stepping foot onto a pitch on a Premier League match day will not only have a stadium full of people, they'll also have all the people watching at home and everything around that. The TV, everything will be there. If they're scared of coming into the changing room afterwards, how do we expect them to be able to go out onto the pitch and then kind of do their best? And if they're not comfortable around the team environment that they're in. So, and this isn't about not telling them when it's not good enough, but it's about them knowing that you still value them as a human being after it. So you can shake hands with your colleague when you've had a blazing row about something that you disagree with. So it's not always about getting it right all the time or agreeing with everything, and it's not about being nice all the time. It's about the foundations that are there, that there is a common purpose and value as to why you are both there and why you're doing what you're doing. And I think a really good example would be kind of the stories we've heard about the Alex Ferguson era at Man United. And he was a manager who was able to get the best out of a lot of the athletes he worked with. Not all of them. He obviously didn't get it right with every single one, but for a lot of the athletes he worked with, he was able to bring out the best in them. And we heard about the hairdryer treatment and him throwing things around the dressing rooms, but we also hear the stories where players talk about him being a father figure and being a person that they can talk to and confide in. And he would go and visit them in hospital when they had surgeries and they were injured. He'd be the first person to phone them. He'd make sure he went and visited them. He'd call and check in with their families. He was a part of their life, not just their football. And he'd show them he valued them as a person and he cared enough about them as a person, not just as a player. And he cared about all those things that were going on from them off the pitch as well. So just like in a family where you can argue with a sibling all day long, but there's still that love, care and respect there for them. And this is that kind of environment. If you can create that within these elite sport settings, it gives you a real amazing platform to kind of build on. So to develop these creative, independent decision makings, it requires players to be able to access that higher thinking part of their brain, which requires this psychological safety. They may still perceive threat in stepping foot onto a pitch with millions of people watching, but if in their training environments and the environments off the pitch that they have, they are psychologically safe, the pathways of good decision making are more likely to be reinforced, and their instinctual behaviours will hopefully more often than not be right in those high pressure moments. So in terms of the wellbeing elements, I think I've alluded to quite a lot of these already. Around it, a psychologically safe environment enables us to look after ourselves and look after each other, which obviously promotes positive well-being. It gives us the opportunity for autonomy, making our own decisions in what we're doing. And it also means we're more likely to view these challenges that we face as opportunities rather than threats, and have confidence that when we do that. And it means within the team environment, there's that inclusivity, trust and respect, and then the opportunity to disagree as well, which I think is really, really important. Because I think if we're not disagreeing, we're not doing everything right. So where do we go from there? I think disagreements can be a real fundamental part of progressing. So I think these all function to boost our well-being and make a stressful and challenging work environment a much more positive and enjoyable place, rather than working in a place of fear and worry. So then kind of going on to that winning side, it's so important from that winning element where you have the ability to take the right risks at the right times. And you are able to speak out and speak your mind when something isn't right, in terms of building resilience and facing challenges and building a strong team ethos and culture, which we've seen through kind of the success of the All Blacks and other kind of top quality teams, is a really key element of high performance. And the All Blacks have, obviously there's a really interesting book on kind of how the culture and things was developed there. And I think that's a really good example of the culture and this kind of environment around players being so fundamental, that even though they don't have the biggest pool of people to pick from, they are able to get the best out of those athletes and compete with populations that are much, much larger than New Zealand. So well-being and winning cannot be separated. So they come completely together, and how we feel on and off the pitch has a huge influence on what happens on it. So I think players play best and perform to their best when they're enjoying it, because it's really difficult when your mental space is taken up by other things to free up enough space to be able to then perform to the best. And I think this was kind of alluded to a little bit earlier as well, is you can perform, you can still do really well if you're not in a positive place like that, and if you've not had the right environment around you, you can still perform. You can cope and you can manage, you can survive, you can still win medals. But there's those other elements of life which are so important to happiness and enjoyment. So how much better would those experiences feel? How much more likely are you to be able to sustain the levels of performance and be even more successful by feeling the happiness and enjoyment in what you do? So that I know that there are boxers who have spoken about their fear of losing driving them. And I know Rio Ferdinand speaks quite a lot about his fear of losing. So he had a huge number of rituals and superstitions. But Ferdinand also speaks quite openly about the lack of enjoyment he had of winning and achieving. And I think when he talks about looking back on his journey, he'd wished he'd taken a step back sometimes and gone, I wish I enjoyed that a little bit more, because I really did something pretty amazing then. So it can have a real toll on kind of other elements of life. So that coping, managing and surviving isn't enough. It's about more than that growing, challenging and thriving. And I think, as unfortunately for me, a Man United fan because of my mother, putting this slide up is a little bit painful, but I think the culture that Klopp has developed at Liverpool is the epitome of kind of this psychologically safe culture. He talks about everyone having a purpose. He talks about enjoyment, him knowing he's not an expert at everything, and therefore he employs the people around him that are. And he talks about bringing in new players and going, not giving them information and not trying to bombard them with, this is what we do, this is what we do, this is what we do. And he goes, you go out there and you play, and then we'll refine, adapt and work out where you fit from there. He talks about being their friend. He says he can't be their best friend because he won't always agree with them and he won't always do what they want, what he wants them to do, but he's still their friend, rather than just their head coach. And he said that closeness helps him and that helps those players. And I know lots of the players have kind of spoken about him transforming the way that they play. And he obviously is really big on this collaboration and togetherness and just embodies so many of these principles. There's some really good videos of Klopp talking about how he goes about creating team spirit and the environments that he does, and how that's led to the ultimate success of, unfortunately, winning the Premier League. So then when we think about what psychological safety then looks like from a practical perspective, I think the statements here can be used as kind of a bit of an audit tool, really, covering some of the key elements. So these could be questions that you can ask yourselves and kind of reflect on the environments, but also ask colleagues and players as well. So I've done these with anonymous surveys. So there's an app that I use called Mentimeter, where the players bring their phones in and they can just fill them in on their phones. And it gives players that extra security that they can speak their mind, because we're not sure if it's a psychologically safe space for them to do so. And hopefully then it gives us a bit of an understanding as to the areas that you can work on and improve in. So as a coach, the coach potentially holds the athlete's future basically in their hands. And I think that's kind of the perception of a coach from a lot of young athletes. And in the first team environments or like those settings as well, that a coach might be responsible for team selection. There's so much of their future that the coach holds in their hands. So you can give them their future, you can give them everything they want, but you can also take it away from them. So that power imbalance can be quite difficult, make it quite difficult to assess this, which is why I think that the anonymity of being able to do these is really important. But it could also be their perceptions of things. It might be that somebody's doing a lot of things right, but the athlete still potentially has a bit of a perception. So I think that's really important to kind of understand as well. There are also kind of these warning signs, I suppose, to look out for in terms of a lack of psychological safety. So I get really concerned if I'm delivering something to a group of players and nobody's willing to talk or put their hand up or feel comfortable speaking, because that concerns me about the type of environment that I've created within that session. We can all kind of adapt what we say in a survey a little bit. Obviously, kind of one of the limitations of kind of anything self-reported, but the behaviours consistently are more difficult to manage. So if they're not asking questions or don't feel comfortable admitting mistakes, so you might sit down with a player and look at an analysis session, and it might be that the player's not really kind of able to point out what they've done wrong because either they haven't got the ability to do that, or it's that they don't really want to point out what's gone wrong because they're worried about what the consequences of that might be. So we want them to be asking questions, and we don't want them to feel uncomfortable when they make a mistake, and we don't want them to avoid the difficult conversations, and the ones that don't ask for help, that can be a bit of a concern as well. We want them to have disagreements. And I think the other thing is, if you don't know too much about them on a personal level, parents' names, siblings, what parents do, who they live with at home, those sorts of things, it could be just a sign to maybe take a few kind of positive steps to improve the psychological safety of the environments. So building relationships, I think, is the absolute fundamental building block to this. And I know that was kind of discussed a little bit in that athlete panel as well. Having genuine relationships creates trust, that better communication, and it gives them the opportunity to have that winning mentality. So there's a lot of research into kind of coach-athlete relationships. So Sophia Jowett has done a lot of good further reading on that if you do want to know kind of a little bit more. But on that practical level, like, how much do you know about players or athletes you work with in both their sport and out of it? So one thing that I make sure I do when I'm kind of trying to get to know a group of players is I'll spend days and days with them at training sessions and matches, and I try and show them that I'm willing to put in the work and invest into what they love and what they're doing. So I'll stand outside at a training session in the snow, in the rain, and watch those training sessions and engage with them as part of that to show them that I do care. And I'll never decline a message or a phone call, whether that's at 9 in the morning, 9 at night, 3 in the morning. Like, it becomes one of those things that they know I'm there. I think it's the most fundamental part of kind of building a relationship and what I do in my role in that setting. I quite often, when I first get to know a player, I'll sit down with them and try and get them to talk to me about their journey. And I use this as kind of like either a timeline or a bit of a map idea. And I'll sit down with them and kind of say to them, okay, so what's your earliest memory of football? And we'll talk about their earliest memory. And then we'll look at, okay, so what were the biggest challenges that you remember at kind of when you were an under 9? Do you remember anything about that? All of those sorts of things. And we'll go through their timeline and their journey in sport because they feel comfortable talking about sport. And then we'll look at, okay, so that was when you changed school there, wasn't it? So how did that go for you? And it kind of just builds that base of knowledge about them. You get to ask questions about their family, but it's all centered around this discussion about their sport. And I think that's a really good way of kind of starting to that relationship building process and really getting to know them. So it helps you treat them like an individual and show them that you care, because you're asking all these questions and you're wanting to know more about them. And making time for them again and showing them that you care about them and you'll believe in them. So another thing that I quite like to do is get all athletes to kind of reflect on themselves when they're at their best. What do they need from the people around them to be at their best? How they can be helped on a match day. And we put these on like a one-page document, and these one-page documents are then shared with all the other players and the staff. So it gives us all an opportunity to kind of learn a little bit more about each other and also kind of how we function within that group setting. And I found that a really good way of kind of creating discussion and this idea of kind of disagreement and challenge and those sorts of things, but also helping coaches have the information to then treat them as an individual. And that's been really, really beneficial. And I think this idea of setting the stage, so the expectations, what do they want what do you expect from me is the first question that I will ask when I kind of meet a new group, is like, what do you expect from me? And I'll put that kind of on myself first, and then I'll ask them, okay, so what do you need to be successful? What do we then expect of each other? And then what do you need to do? So what should be my expectation of you? And then what happens if we don't meet an expectation? And I think this works really well to do in collaboration. So grabbing flip chart paper and pens and literally just kind of having a little brainstorming session around these things. Because I think if you can do those things in collaboration, again, it's that autonomy supportive. It's about they feel that their opinion is wanted and valued. And everyone then has a buy-in to it because there's this agreement. And I think in addition to this, there needs to be clear expectations about the kind of problems and failures that happen. So they need to know that there's a difference between those rule violations and the kind of thoughtful hypothesis. I think those are really, really important distinctions to make, and players do need to know that there is a big difference. So if they make a mistake in one game, then potentially they might not be in the starting 11 the next game, but you still value them as a human being, and you're going to do everything you can to help them to get back in that starting 11. And I think that's the real big difference of what happens when you drop a player because of a mistake made like that. Whereas obviously in terms of rule violations, there has to be sanctions in place. And I think that will depend massively on the environments. But it's a really important distinction to make, and they really need to know that there are two. So one of the things I do get players coming and saying to me is that they're scared of kind of making a mistake because they're worried about not getting picked. And then they're worried that if they're not picked, they're kind of pushed out a little bit. So it's really important to get that bit right, because you are going to have to drop them if they're not performing. But being able to then put the value back on them as a human being and showing them that you care enough to help them progress again is really, really important there. And when I say kind of framing the work here, I think that's about, you don't expect it to go perfectly. And in sport and much of life, there's this ever-present potential for things to go completely wrong. And that's completely fine. And we'll learn from it, grow from it, and be better because of it. I also think the language element's really important. So you must not type rules, I think, can be really, really difficult and challenging in these settings, because it emphasizes these negative kind of thinking patterns and these mental filters that we keep hold of all the negative things, and the positive things tend to float away and we don't pay as much attention to them. But the language we hear shapes our thoughts and our responses. So some of the words we hear probably fill us with a sense of fear and dread. So some people, when they hear the word like there's being an investigation done, that could be really quite threatening. Whereas if we're doing a study on this, it's kind of slightly less a threatening term. And that's kind of one of the examples that they use in the medical profession. When something went wrong, they called them studies rather than investigations. And again, it meant people were more willing to kind of share their mistakes. When instead of asking when things go wrong, they would ask, was everything as safe as you would like it to be? So that again promoted people to share. And I think their language is absolutely fundamental, but also there's a little caveat to that if you change language and don't change behavior, that can be even worse, because it creates this hypocrisy then, and then players are they don't know what to expect, and it becomes even more challenging, and it creates an even more sense of ambiguity in their minds. So I think it's really important to make that change in terms of both language and behavior. And then this humility isn't about playing down the skill set, but knowing that we live in an unpredictable world. We don't all have a crystal ball, and I don't know is an acceptable answer when you don't know. And I think sometimes that can be quite difficult to say sometimes, but it makes people more approachable, and it is a sign of good leadership when someone doesn't know something. You're not trying to like fumble your way through an answer. You just can say, I don't actually know. I'll have a look and see if I can get back to you. And it might be that you have to bring other people in, which leads us next on to this idea of inviting participation. So I think it's absolutely absurd for anybody to think that they have all the answers about everything, because even if you're a complete expert in your field, we all live through a biased lens because of our own perceptions, and our own experiences shape the kind of knowledge that we have. So we'll never ever have full knowledge, and then we need to ask questions to even get closer to that. So showing vulnerability and humility by asking questions and inviting people to share their thoughts and responses, I think is really important. And kind of one thing that I will always do when working with a player is frame to them that they're the expert in them. Like, I'm not the expert in them. I might be able to ask them some questions and give them some advice on certain things, but they're the expert, not me. So I'm learning from them too. And I think that really supports the kind of buy-in for the work that we do, because they know that I'm listening to them and listening to what they're saying. So I think asking questions and trying to engage them is so important. Drawing out their knowledge and using it to inform and develop yours, and then responding proactively. So showing that appreciation for a question being asked. So I know sometimes when a kid puts their hand up and asks a silly question, the rest of the group might have a little giggle about it. But giving them the kind of reward afterwards of saying, like, so how can I help, or how can I make this better? Reinforces the behavior and means those behaviors are more likely to happen, because we want them to ask questions, even if sometimes they are silly questions, because they might not know the answer to that, and to everybody else that might seem strange. So in kind of the environment that I'm in now, we've had players come into the academy system quite late. So one of the players that's come in quite late will ask questions, and the other lads will look at him and be like, why are you asking that? But he genuinely doesn't know, because he's not been in that system before. So the fact that he was willing to put his hand up and ask those questions, I think is absolutely brilliant. And the other lads have kind of understood that now, because of the way that we've kind of dealt with him asking those questions and the response that we've given to him asking those questions. So I think they're dealing with mistakes. Again, it's so important to make that distinction I've mentioned earlier. So mistakes cannot be held against somebody once they've kind of been resolved as well. I think that's another kind of really important element to it, but it's really about this rule and value violation being a complete distinction to a mistake, and this idea of a thoughtful hypothesis. Somebody trying to do the right thing but not executing it right is very different to something that breaks a significant rule or value. And again, the kind of this Alex Ferguson era where players would be dropped and they would have to deal with not being in the team, they will also get that care and value from him as their manager, that they know that he's going to help them get back to where they were, or have the people around them that will help them get back to where they were and help them get back in that starting 11. So throughout a lot of athletes' life, especially kind of these young developing athletes, the coach is often a role model and someone that they spend so much time with, probably more so than kind of family, friends, all of that. And they have a power that nobody else has. So as a coach, if you can then admit that you've made a mistake, and show that curiosity to learn and grow, it can really reinforce the belief that it's okay for them to do that too. Making parts of training where they will absolutely make mistakes and they will do things wrong and they will need support, but those are the opportunities that they get to grow, and the support looks different for different individuals. And I think that goes back to the relationship and making sure you know them, because just like a scaffolding on a building will look different depending on what the building looks like, the scaffolding or the support that we put around a player will be completely different depending on what that player needs. And they'll need that to then go on to be successful. And as a role model, you can promote that contribution from everyone. So one thing, again, in kind of the environment I'm in at the moment that we've done is every player across the season gets the opportunity to present about the opposition we're about to face. So if we have a game against Chelsea at the weekend, a group of players will go away and they'll have a look at the strengths of the Chelsea team, the areas where they're not so great and we can exploit. They'll look at their key players and their shape and just any kind of key elements that are going to help the other teammates for the game. And I think that's one way we've really got buy-in to their contribution, because they now feel like they're part of that game plan. So we've really managed to get, this level of buy-in from bringing them into the process. So we'll present some level of information on those match days, but it will also be about them giving their opinions as well. So then coming back kind of full circle on this, how to develop psychological safety, and Jurgen Klopp here, this is a screenshot from one of the videos that he's done about relationships, and he talks about everything we do in life is about relationships, because we don't live in isolation. We all live within this interdependent world, and especially in sport, everybody kind of relies on each other to do something for all those cogs to work. So when working in these environments, these relationships are absolutely fundamental, because we all have some level of responsibility, and we all have responsibility, as he says, when we walk into the room, we are all somewhat responsible for the mood in that room. So to build psychological safety, having these positive relationships with each other and with the players that you work with can help build the skills and attributes that are needed for elite professional athletes who can thrive on those biggest stages. And I think sometimes people do say that the organisation doesn't help them build psychological safety. So their organisation that they work within doesn't make them feel in those ways. And I think, again, it kind of comes back to the point I kind of mentioned at the beginning around it doesn't matter almost how the organisation will have a big influence, but as an individual, you can still have an influence on the group of people that you work with. So those individuals, this quote always comes into my mind when talking about it, because one person within an environment can make a massive difference to how that player feels. And it could be anyone within that environment. It might be somebody who, it might be the analyst who they just see every now and then. They might come in and spend loads of time with that person, and that person might be the person that they feel really psychologically safe with, because that person has done the work to do that. So I think it's so important that as each individual within an environment knows about this and how to create it, because then even if the organization doesn't support it, you can still support those players as an individual, and you can make a massive, massive difference to that individual's life. And if that doesn't result in high performance in terms of their well-being, you've been able to offer that support for that person through that really challenging time for them. And you can create that space for them to be happier, but also help them have that ability to thrive and be successful and win, because you're a person that they feel safe admitting their mistakes to, and you can then help them kind of grow from those. So as an individual, you can still make a really massive difference. So thank you so much for listening to that, and hopefully we've got time for a few questions.
Thank you very much, Kim. That was amazing. Thank you very much. We loved that, and just wonderful to get an insight into, you know, elite development and academy settings and how we might develop psychological safety. We've probably only got time for one question, because we are kind of running out of time, unfortunately. But has anyone got a question for Kim?
I have a question, yeah?
Yeah, go on.
So I'm going to try and